The notebook sat under lead whenever anyone opened it. Not a flourish of language, a fact. The pages touched by her salts kept a faint, stubborn glow. Museums wrapped them in metal as if shielding something alive. In that slow, humming light was a contract she had made with herself long before the world learned her name. She did not want fame. She did not want medals or a portrait in a hall. She wanted one thing, and she laid her life down for it, the permission to understand. She was practical about that permission. She found ways to pay for books. She taught herself the grammar of laboratory tools. She learned to be more economical with sleep than most people manage in a lifetime. She moved through education like a miner moves through stone. Never fast, always where the work demanded. When she said life held nothing to fear, only things to be understood, she had not yet imagined how literal that sentence would map onto her body. The phrase was a law she followed, not a comfort to clutch on bad nights. At first, the stakes were not abstract. Her early notebooks were cramped with accounts of cheap reagents and failed separations. She wrote temperature readings in margins with hands numb from the damp mansard air of Paris. The work was material and ugly, cracked glass, bitter fumes, blisters on fingers. There was no glamour. The glow that made headlines began as a stubborn apologetic flicker in a test tube left too long on a workbench. When the glow came, wonder did not erase the cost. It sat beside the cost like a single bright piece of rock on a mud floor. The blue-white shimmer leaking from certain salts was beautiful in a way that tightened her throat. Beauty and danger fit together like two parts of a wound. Step by patient step, she learned that light could be instrument and weapon. She learned to measure it, to box it with mathematics, to name its behavior so others might use it. She named one gift for the place she had been born into exile, a small, hard tribute. She would not let geography be erased by science. She put the memory of homeland into a label. A small vial stayed on her desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the deal she had agreed to. At night, when the lab grew cold and the city slept, she would hold the vial up and watch the faint luminescence edge the glass. It was a private reckoning. Light that saved could also lay claim. There was no celebrity in that calculation, only a stubborn ledger of choices. Each experiment wrote a line, one step forward, one bruise taken, one moment of clarity purchased with a small, inexorable expense. Her approach to the world was as unromantic as her notebooks were intimate. She measured, reduced, repeated. A well-made table of results mattered more to her than an applauding audience. When the world offered applause, she accepted it like a tool, useful if it enabled work, dangerous if it distracted. That balance, hunger for knowledge versus the cost of pursuing it, became the axis on which the rest of her life turned. In this first chapter, the ledger began to fill. There was no prophecy in the handwriting, only the quiet, relentless arithmetic of someone who had decided that understanding was worth any price she could foresee. The city smelled of coal smoke and wet cobbles. Warsaw under occupation kept its books like contraband. Doors closed quietly. Lamps were dimmed. In a schoolteacher's small room, a key scraping its lock late at night sounded like a tiny act of treason. People didn't come here to kill time. They came to keep thinking. She was small enough then to fold her knees on a chair and hide a notebook under her skirt. She learned to make her body into a safe. Pages were thin and cramped with pencil lessons that left dust on fingertips. When the teacher lowered his voice and the room leaned in, silence became a skill. To listen meant secrecy. To write meant risking discovery. The risk felt ordinary, necessary as bread. The secret classes were called the Flying University, not because they moved fast, but because they moved like breath. They showed up in different rooms on different nights. To join, you needed a name whispered in the right ear and the rule not to look around when you left. There was a code, Enter on the left, sit by the stove, pass notes folded twice. The students were not heroic in any dramatic way. They were clever in the small, steady ways that keep knowledge alive, hiding the margins of books in sleeves, copying a paragraph into a pocket, and emptying it later beneath a table. She learned early that education could be a map you carried hidden under your coat. Her mother told her stories of a country stolen by treaties and indifferent men with seals. Those stories were not just geography, they were pressure. If a state could be erased on paper, she decided, it could be returned on purpose. Science might spell a nation back into history. One name, one element, one proof at a time. Naming polonium would be a private first step, an act of claim. Her notebooks from that time were not manifestos. They were logs, temperatures, observations, scraps of translation, small rebellions against forgetting. A copied sentence from a banned author, a list of books to find, a note about an experiment to try when funds allowed. Her handwriting tightened around facts the way a miner clutches the edge of a rock. She didn't write for applause. She wrote to keep things from being lost. Warsaw taught her a vocabulary of caution. It taught her how to fold a question into silence so the question would survive. It taught her to judge people by how they reacted when a page fell from a sleeve. It taught her that truth is dangerous not because it's loud, but because it refuses to be locked away quietly. Those who guarded knowledge had keys that clanked. Those who needed it had hands that shook. She decided which side of the lock she would stand on. In nights of cold and whisper, she also learned the shape of desire that would guide her life, an appetite for understanding so precise it left no room for sentiment. Above all, she wanted to work. Work meant a truth that could not be shelved. It meant the possibility of returning a name to the map. She left Warsaw with that small, stubborn ledger in her pocket and a skill no classroom had taught, how to make herself invisible while stealing the future. The city had given her fear and taught her how to use it. The risk was practical, not romantic, a measurement to be made, a door to open at the right hour, a line of prose copied without trembling. In rooms where men turned the key, knowledge was hidden like contraband. She became the kind of thief who didn't rob books from people, but rescued them into the light. Paris did not meet her with postcards. It met her with damp air and small mercies. A landlord who let late rent slide, a cafe that traded black coffee for conversation, a stare that complained under every footstep. She moved into a mansard room that smelled of old paper and colder nights. Ink on the pages would freeze into a thin crust in the mornings. She learned to press a cup on the notebook to keep the numbers legible. The cup left a ring the size of a coin, the coin of her life, a tiny everyday marker of the work she had chosen. She kept almost no luxuries. An empty flask was one. Clean, round, strict. Hold it up to winter light, and the glass looked like a promise. A small vessel that could turn patience into result. Her celebrations were not parties, but correct columns in a notebook, a row of temperatures, a margin with nothing crossed out. Every morning began with a task, not a wish. She wrote lists with the economy of someone who had no margin for error. Secure reagent. Sweep. The bench. Repeat the separation 3 times and record each phase. Days became a sequence of technical vows. Discipline demanded her hands, her waking hours, the little warmth she allowed herself that week. The lab was not a theater of sudden discovery. It was persistent labor, chips, breaks, nights when a separation failed and the whole run had to start again. Reagents cost money she rarely had. She bartered chores and favors. Cold hands hardened into precision. Sleep shrank to moments that would not spoil a measurement. Every setback was catalogued and reduced to conditions to control next time. And then, in the middle of the routine, a small stubborn phenomenon appeared, a faint luminescence in certain salts. It did not blaze. It glimmered, reluctant to be seen. The first sighting was almost humorless. Note it, measure it, write the numbers, move on. When beauty arrived as a faint blue-white, she did not gasp. She treated it like a variable. Record, replicate, understand. She learned the other side of that light fast. Handling the materials left marks, small burns, a skin irritation kept under bandages as a private account. The same odd glow that opened a field of possibility also revealed the literal cost of proximity. She kept a tiny vial on a shelf, not a trophy, but a reminder. At night, its faint reflection made the ledger in her pocket feel heavier. Lines in her notebooks began to form patterns. Names and figures gathered the texture of decisions. Radium shifted in the pages from data point to thing that could be used, and therefore something dangerous. That shift was practical and immediate. Containment, safety, how the knowledge would travel. It raised a choice she could not ignore, enclose and profit, or let it flow. Her past taught that choice. The exile she carried meant naming could be claim. She named a newly understood substance after the soil she had left behind. Not triumph, but return. A small literal map pinned inside the ledger. People offered her the city's versions of success. Dinners, introductions, invitations. She met them with the same measured courtesy she showed a contaminated test tube. Nights recalculating, won over salons. A penny saved for reagents beat a night of silk. The austerity was not asceticism, it was calculation. It made the light clearer, not more delicious. Paris supplied colleagues, markets, libraries, but it did not create the steady practice that turned a curious flicker into a field. That work came from the ledger and the discipline. The faint glow became a steady presence in the margins, promising remedy and hazard. She accepted the promise the way she accepted every ledger entry, a cost to be paid, and she would be the one to pay it. They met over a bench, not in a ballroom. He arrived with steady hands and a way of reading a measurement the way others read a page. She watched him work for a day, more interested in the economy of his movements than in the tilt of his smile. It was not a novel's love at first sight. It was the recognition of another method. Two people who knew how a problem demanded to be solved saw in each other a complement. Their first conversation was about calibration errors and how a balance refused to hold when the air was humid. They argued briefly, adjusted the apparatus, and then both wrote the same numbers in their notebooks. That was their first ritual. Their house became a workshop because they didn't know how to be otherwise. Plates and bowls shared space with glassware. A napkin might hold a half-finished formula. A teacup cooled beside a pipette. Mornings began with the bench check. Wipe the balances, inspect seals, note reagent stock. Dinner was measured in minutes. Finish column. 3, then return. When strangers imagined tenderness as candlelight, theirs looked like a clean bench and 2 coats on the same peg. It was precise, not less intense for that. They set rules that read like contracts. Speak plainly about work. Be unforgiving with sloppiness. Protect one another from vanity. No grandstanding at seminars. No showmanship that wastes time or reagents. Their most radical rule concerned ownership. When a separation yielded a faint glow, the first question was not how to sell it, but who should have access. Over coffee and a plate, they wrote an answer in the corner of a notebook. Knowledge as a common resource, not a toll. Do not patent. Do not fence the methods. Whoever held the formula had a duty to the public, not a right to profit. That sentence was procedural more than moral. Patents would complicate replication, slow distribution, and keep the light from doing what light does. Reach those who needed it. Work shaped their days and the texture of their speech. They spoke in units, minutes, degrees, molarities, small gestures accumulated into a life. When one burned a finger, the other handed a compress and the exact instruction. Record the time of contact. Note the temperature. Do not repeat the careless motion. When an instrument failed, they read the failure as data and adjusted protocol. Treating human error like experimental error made the partnership efficient and uncompromising. Private moments were rarely public. Instead of love letters, there were interleaved pages of calculations, margin notes that read like shorthand compliments. Well done. See here. Correct. At night, with the lab lights humming, they sometimes sat with a single piece of glass between them and watched its faint luminescence. The light did not need sentiment. It needed stewardship. Watching it together felt like a pact. They wrote their vows into the ledger of their work. The public misread the edges of this life. People expected passion as confession or conflagration. Instead, the world saw two people who refused to grandstand and preferred a clean column of numbers to applause. When someone whispered that a patent would feed their work and grant independence, they answered with the same economy as at the bench. A firm no, justified by replicability. A method locked behind a patent could not be checked, taught cheaply, or spread. For them, science was not inheritance, but a machine needing more hands. That choice carried cost. Openness meant foregoing quicker comforts. Money for supplies would have come faster if they sold steps, claimed precedence, or made the method proprietary. They accepted slower expansion in exchange for faster adoption by others. The logic was strategic, not romantic. The more others could reproduce the phenomenon, the sooner practical uses would appear, and the faster the idea would be refined. They traded potential wealth for accelerated truth. In the small hours, when deadlines vanished and the city allowed one, poor dinner before sleep, they spoke of the future like schedules. "We will teach students this way," he would say. "We will arrange the separation like this," she would reply. They planned systems, not monuments, teaching methods, standard procedures, a lab that could survive without them. Their intimacy was procedural, a machine built to outlast its makers. The image that summed their collaboration arrived quietly. On a shelf, a salt sat in a small jar, glowing like a private lamp in a room otherwise used to night. They did not photograph it for the press or parade it at salons. They placed it where only those who maintained it could see it. That placement was an act, a refusal to turn discovery into theater, a refusal to trade method for spectacle. It insisted that wonder, once reduced to protocol and taught, should be unremarkable in the best sense, an ordinary tool to improve lives. Their marriage was not sentimentality, but the formalization of two approaches converging. The rigor of one, mind folded into the rigor of another. It gave speed and immunity to distraction. Their life looked like a well-run laboratory because it was one. In the rows of notebooks on their shelves, in marginal notes crossing each other like shorthand signatures, lived the evidence of one decision. Design a system to let a fragile light be understood and shared, not bought and hidden. They worked with a stubborn patience that reshaped their hands. Days were not glamour, but weight, heavy sacks of ore, long hours over steaming kettles, the small ritual of ladle, sieve, pail. The material was coarse and indifferent, pitchblende and uranium residues, and it took cruelty to the body to get anything useful from it. The lab looked like a place that refused comforts, a low roof leaking at the seams, benches scarred with acid burns, a brazier where hands warmed briefly between separations. She learned to measure pain the way she measured temperature. Note the time, note the wound, continue. Solutions hissed and spat. The air tasted of metal and vinegar. Breathing itself became work. Acids and bases could eat skin if attention slipped. Glassware cracked from thermal shock. A clogged filter meant starting over. Every failure was not just a setback, but a real subtraction from scarce supplies. She traded favors, currency, and sleep to keep the process running. Nights bled into mornings, and the ledger filled with lines that read like defiance. Quantity processed, weight recovered, purity achieved. They were inventorying a miracle in bookkeeping language. There was one day that might have been defeat. An old distillation kettle developed a hairline fracture at the moment a heated batch reached the stage they'd waited for. Boiling liquid spurted from the seam. A sheet of steam rolled like a scalding wave across the bench. She was nearest. The burn took skin and pride at once. She walked back to their single chair, holding a compress, and did not shout. Instead, she dictated numbers to Pierre with the spare cadence of someone recording data, not complaint. Record the time of rupture, record the temperature, recalc the yield against loss. He wrote. Pain became input, not reason to stop. Days kept that rhythm. Effort, error, correction. Sometimes the hope felt like rumor. Weeks passed with no hint of the glow. They ground, dissolved, precipitated, filtered, compacted residues until fingers remembered each texture. On the bench, the work became a grammar. How a precipitate broke, how a cloud settled, which flame meant impurity. When the light finally appeared, it was shy and stubborn, not a blaze, but a thin blue-white from salts in a corner bottle. It did not demand attention. She noticed because habit had trained her to see micro-signals others filed as noise. She set down her pipette, took a measured reading, wrote it down, and repeated it. The second reading matched the first. Repeatability turned wonder into a problem to solve. The first sight brought two reactions, quiet delight and cold recognition of risk. The salts that shone left tiny burns, skin reddened without clear bruises. The vial on the high shelf was less trophy than talisman, a reminder that discovery could be generous and possessive at once. She learned the arithmetic of proximity, what an hour at the bench would cost in wear, what gain it might yield, and recorded it, without sentiment. Naming mattered to her like planting a flag. When she labeled a separated substance polonium, it was a small restitution, a private act of memory shaped like science. It was not a headline, but a map pinned to a page. When radium emerged, a sample that glowed more insistently, it translated into a different register, something to be harnessed, measured, and used. Their joy that night was not a roar, but a close, steady silence by a small fire. They did not parade the result. They wrote it into the ledger, compared columns, argued solvents and precipitates, then returned to work. The glow sat on the shelf like a patient witness. They treated it like data. Replicate, communicate, teach. Under the careful language flowed another current, the knowledge that a fragile beauty had been wrested from filth, and that the cost would be tallied in ways not yet visible. They counted the gain and tallied the price, and in both sums they found the measure of what they had agreed to do. The ceremony moved with the measured grace of institutions that can honor genius without owning it. Lights, speeches, names carved into wood and metal, applause like a slow tide. She took the medal with hands steady from heat and attention. He stood beside her, fingers stained the same dark color. For a moment the world looked like a place that kept its promises, a prize for work, a ledger balanced by recognition. The photograph would show two composed figures, collars straight, the ribbon catching light. The photograph would not show the cost. A few streets away, the city kept its usual small risks. Rain made the cobbles shine. Lamps reflected in puddles like tiny false suns. A cart, driven by a man used to measuring distance, caught the tram rail. Ordinary motion became a force with no sympathy for ledgers. Pierre stepped into the path. It took less than a breath. A wheel, a fall, a moment that erased plans and left an absence shaped like a chair. She learned the fact the way she learned measurements, with a sequence of necessary motions, not theatrics. No scream, no collapse. She moved through the tasks with the same administrative precision she used in the lab. Name, time, place. At the bridge where he'd fallen, she saw the wet flagstones and the broken umbrella, useless and torn like an accusation. It had tried to protect him from rain. It had failed. To others, it might be a grotesque symbol. To her, it was a detail to note and carry in the ledger. Grief for her was work to be performed with exacting order. She did not give the public the collapse they expected. She folded the arrangements into days, like an experiment protocol. Friends waited for unmooring. Instead, she returned to the bench where their names would sit side by side in the margins. She set a cup down. The empty chair across from her was the only audience. Then she spoke a sentence that was not consolation, but judgment. Progress is not fast and easy. It was a verdict, precise, pitiless, true. It asked for recognition, not pity. There was a cruelty in the timing. The world applauded the idea and, in the same rhythm, took a person. Medals glittered in the press while the street whispered about injury. Newspapers would record both as if they were separate worlds. She knew they were the same account. The honor meant little to the life interrupted. The loss meant everything to the life that remained. She did not grow harder. The word would be wrong. But she grew inevitable. Where compassion might have softened choices, now tenderness was routed through work. She did not give up. She kept moving, with the same quiet arithmetic. In the weeks after, the public performed its rituals, condolences, speeches, flowers. People offered phrases meant to mend what could not be mended. She accepted them without theatrics. She arranged papers, signed receipts, met officials. At night, under a single lamp, she read Pierre's marginal notes. A casual annotation became a voice. She kept the little things, how he annotated an instrument, the shorthand about a solvent, a joke in the hand that had held hers. Those things were evidence that work and life had been braided, not severed. The public wanted tidy heroes, honors, surviving tragedy, a neat script. Reality refused tidy arcs. In her ledger, the same columns that recorded yields and temperatures now contained an absence, measured as precisely as any result. Time lost, a hand not present, a voice not there to correct an error. Sorrow for her was material fact, not rhetoric. The bench demanded attention because it was where the cost of discovery could be seen, counted, and, insofar as that was possible, paid. That winter, the city would remember the photograph and the umbrella. Students would whisper about the woman who stepped back to work instead of into spectacle. Some criticized her for not dramatizing grief. They missed that for her. The work was not consolation, but duty. She kept two things true. She mourned, and she continued. In that continuity, people later called stubbornness, holiness, or plain wear. She called it the only way to answer loss without betraying the work they had done together. The world kept applauding the discovery while the cobbles dried. The broken umbrella remained a small private detail in a large accounting. She walked the streets carrying both the medal and the memory, her language condensed to statements with the weight of law. Progress is not fast and easy. Sometimes it is cruel. It is not obliged to be fair. She had not been made stronger by what took him. She had been made more inevitable. She continued the arithmetic of understanding. A life's work turned into numbers, protocols, and a steady insistence that the light they coaxed from ore would be used to help bodies, not feed vanity. The hall carried the weight of old wood and older expectations. Benches groaned under bodies that had come not just for a lecture, but for an event. A woman standing where men had long stood. The aisles were full. Some pressed their shoulders to the doorframe because there was not enough seat for curiosity. She walked in without flourish. She didn't need it. Her coat still smelled faintly of reagents and street air. Her hands showed the small scars of glass and acid. That made the room listen more than any ribbon could. She opened the notebook that had been at the center of her life, and let her fingers find a page where Pierre's handwriting had stopped mid-line. An unfinished sentence. For most people, that page would be a wound. For her, it was an instrument. She read the line aloud, plainly and exactly. Then she held the pause. The pause was deliberate, the kind a surgeon takes before making an incision. It wasn't silence because she had nothing to say. It was silence because she wanted the room to settle into the problem the way she wanted them to. The hold did work others rarely used. It turned passive listeners into active thinkers. In that held space, the audience stopped seeing a woman giving a lecture and started facing a question. The pause was an educational tool disguised as modesty. When she continued, she finished the sentence like a calculation, precise, inevitable. She did not add theatrics. She spoke to instruct. Temperatures, decay rates, separation techniques. She translated complexity into steps. Her sentences were lean. A method became a map. A map could be taught. Taught things could be repeated. That clear line from observation to instruction made people sit straighter. It wasn't spectacle that held them. It was competence made articulate. Her voice did not waver. It was compact and, when needed, sharp. She never asked the audience to pity a private loss. She did not turn grief into authority. Instead, she used absence as evidence. Pierre's unfinished line proved that work continued beyond individuals. Data outlived its authors. She treated loss the way she treated contamination. Note it, record it, adapt the protocol, proceed. Her cadences made gaps instructive. A missing colleague became a variable to account for, not theater to perform. Students noticed the small details others missed. The pen she used was cheap and dependable. She held it with the same economy she brought to an instrument screw. When she described a separation step, she paused again, barely, to let the room map meaning into motion. That micro-pause became contagious. Listeners timed their breathing to her method. The lecture room quieted, not out of reverence for a person, but out of respect for a process being revealed. A woman had taken the stage, and by the first equations the hall no longer treated her as exception. It treated her as law. There were moments of gentle provocation. When a hand rose to ask about priority or prize, she steered ambition, or it's into responsibility. Knowledge, she explained, cannot be a toll. If you want something useful, make it repeatable. If you want it fair, teach it. The answer cut through academic posturing like a calibrated knife. A method that cannot be replicated cheaply and reliably is of dubious use. The room took that as a practical injunction rather than moralizing. She used silence as punctuation. After a complex explanation, she would stop, let the formula sit, then say, with the economy of someone who had seen the cost of distraction, "Now imagine doing this in a field hospital." The leap forced the audience to convert theory into effect. Shifting from experiment to human consequence did more to hold attention than any rhetorical flourish. It made the lecture practical and urgent. Where others might have let emotion become drama, she let it serve instruction. A failed separation became a lesson about redundancy. A burned finger became a command about record-keeping. The personal and the procedural braided together until neither read as mere story. They were both data. By the time she closed, the room had changed. Skeptics left with new regard for a method. Novelty seekers left with an acquired habit. The pause, the check, the way to turn an observation into a reliable step. The applause was measured, like stamping a protocol into a manual. Outside, the street returned to its small noises. Inside, a lecture pause had taught a crowd to listen differently. An unfinished line became a teaching point. The woman on the podium had not asked for sympathy. She had delivered a discipline. The hall stopped treating her as exception and began to see her as a model for making knowledge durable. People left not merely impressed but equipped, carrying a small instruction they could practice the next day. The press wanted blood. They found a story and sharpened it until every sentence cut. Papers that had praised her work turned their type into hounds. Insinuation dressed as investigation. Accusation served with outrage. Men in cafes read the same rumors and nodded as if they'd discovered the truth. At night, the house that had been a workshop began to take blows. Stones hit panes with a dull thud, presence becoming threat. A cracked window could be repaired, but repair did not change that a private life had been turned into a public weapon. Editors who knew nothing of chemical separations suddenly felt a moral duty to pronounce judgment. The smear ran on two currents: sex and foreignness. Some journalists wrapped moral outrage around their copy. Others sharpened the knife with xenophobia. She was an outsider, they said, someone who took more than she should. Caricatures reduced her to cartoon: a woman in a lab coat, a broken heart in one hand, a test tube in the other. Conversation moved. From decay curves to scandal. She watched the papers like a scientist inspects a contaminated sample. Observe, record, do not contaminate the bench. She did not answer with denials or speeches, not because she couldn't, but because she had priorities. When asked whether to explain her private life to save the work, she answered in the only language she trusted: method. Some colleagues defended her. Some kept distance. The scientific community was a chorus of careers and caution. Letters of support drifted under the daily clang of sensational typesetting. Scandal bent public attention away from the slow translation of experiment into application. Her reply was plain and relentless. She returned to the bench. If the papers wanted spectacle, she offered procedure. If the crowd demanded confession, she offered replication. Small acts, recalibrate note, correct a misreported temperature, became her testimony. In public, she kept teaching, showing how to manage separations and measure yield. In private, she let the vial sit high on the shelf as a reminder. Discovery can be beautiful and dangerous, and both must be handled with care. There was strategy in refusal. To storm back with indignation would feed the drama. To withdraw would let the story metastasize. She chose a middle course: work as answer, ledger as testimony. Gradually, the methods she published and taught allowed other labs to reproduce the findings. Newspapers did not fall silent overnight. Papers crave momentum. But diffusion of method undercut scandal. Many hands doing the work made the discovery belong to practice, not gossip. Her inner life never became public spectacle because she refused to make it so. Where the crowd assumed absence of feeling, she showed feeling in discipline. The exact way she recorded a result, the precise time she scheduled a class, the steady cadence of work repeated without flourish. The scandal exposed ugly currents, moral theater, the ease of weaponizing a woman's reputation, but it also clarified her character. She was not a martyr. She was an artisan insisting that the terms of labor be respected. In the end, stones and headlines left surface marks. Inside the lab, process continued. People still came to learn separations and see in a grain of matter a new kind of light. The scandal remained loud and vivid in public memory, but the work moved in quieter channels. Hospitals that would one day use the light, universities teaching the method, students carrying the protocol forward. The papers could scream for a season. Method, once spread and adopted, was harder to unmake. She had chosen. Reputation could be battered and repaired, but the practice of doing the work, teaching it, and letting it go, that was how discovery outlived scandal. The second prize arrived like a formal note slipped into a room already changed. Speeches, officials moving with quiet choreography, honors given without getting close to the people who paid for them. She accepted the ribbon with a steady hand. In the ledger she kept at home that same week, a new thin arithmetic appeared. Fewer red cells, slower recovery, a fatigue that did not answer rest. The public saw the medal. Her body recorded the subtraction. Blood tests became paperwork she could not ignore. Numbers fell. Doses of strength diminished. Ordinary resilience frayed. She started hiding small things from visiting students. A finger that bruised on the bench. A stubborn pallor photographs could not show. Her glasses thickened out of necessity. The world sharpened through glass, while the glass itself blurred with a tiredness that settled like dust. She did not dramatize decline. She catalogued it. Record. Compensate. Continue. Sorrow and recognition sat at the same table and did not reconcile. The second medal read as Public Vindication. 2 prizes. Work acknowledged across borders. In private, it was a cold piece of metal that did not warm with meaning. Honors did not heal the bruise under the skin or thicken red cells. They were, in the ledger of human things, a check without interest. Official, nominal, incapable of repair. She thanked congratulators the way she answered correspondence about experiments, with measured politeness, notes about future publications, and suggestions for colleagues to validate replications. Business kept the work moving. To yield the stage to grief would have given the world a spectacle that distracted from what had to persist. The method, the replication, the students learning to do what she had done. Work was how she kept warm. When sleep failed, she worked. When appointments filled the day, she set one more test on the bench. She organized teams, taught assistants, scheduled the next separation, as if a plan could outrun the body. The lab offered a litany of small successes, a cleaner precipitate, a marginally better yield, a student who completed a separation without prompting. Each small win was a fragment of heat. They did not restore what the body lost, but they made days meaningful enough not to be only a record of loss. She guarded attention like currency. When reporters asked whether honors softened the conversation, she deflected with procedure. Publish the methods, teach the technique, let others verify. If honor could stimulate practice, it was useful. If it fed vanity, ignore it. Numbers and protocols spoke a stubborn honesty rhetoric could not match. Medals and speeches were props. The experiment was the ongoing business. At night, she sometimes held the small vial near a lamp and watched the faint glow against glass. The glow had once promised discovery and possibility. Now it read also as an account. Handling the vial required gloves, then more precautions. Proximity had become a cost. The discovery that changed the world had also left marks. She counted those marks as she counted reagents, part of the price of making something that had not existed before. She did not regret the arithmetic. She simply observed it, like a scientist accounting for every reagent in a long separation. Public admiration did not supply the practical care a body demanded. Sympathy did not translate into medicine. Congratulations did not buy rest. The winter after the second prize was colder in ways ceremony could not touch. Still she instructed, published, set standards. Her insistence on work as response hardened into habit. For those who only saw medals, that persistence read as stoicism. For those who read the ledger and the bruise beneath the cuff, it was the only way she found to keep the light she had coaxed from darkness serving others, not becoming merely an ornament on a wall. When the war broke, she did not retreat to archives or lecture halls. The bench that had coaxed light from rock had to move. What she once measured out of curiosity now had a brutal duty: to save flesh. They called the units small names in the field: Petites Curies, mobile radiography cars, the Little Curies. The name sounded affectionate until one drove into a casualty clearing station and did for a wounded man what 100 speeches could not. She assembled devices, wrote the procedures, and taught the teams with the same economy she used on reagents. A mobile device without a repeatable protocol was a toy. She refused toys. She drafted checklists like separation protocols, exposure times, positioning marks, a way to mark a plate so surgeons always knew orientation. She wrote the steps in plain language so a novice could follow them under stress. She trained the first teams herself. The women who learned from her were technicians, taught as a craft. Do it again, correct this error, mark the time. She showed them how to steady a frightened hand, how to position a chest so a shrapnel pellet would read as a coin-sized shadow, how to turn a dark oval on a plate into a measured incision rather than a guessing surgeon's cut. Hold rates, distance, shielding where possible. Discipline in a field hospital mattered as much as discipline in a lab. She often rode in the first cars. Roads to the front were potholes and jolts. Equipment bounced at the back like cargo in a storm. She checked valves, replaced seals, tightened screws. When the vehicle reached a tent clinic, fog and mud, canvas stained with oil, she unpacked plates and set the apparatus. The first time she saw a soldier's plate with a clear, round shadow, the professional calm and human outrage met inside her. A coin-sized dark circle lay in a lung field. The surgeon, trembling from exhaustion, planned a blind incision. She leaned in, measured angles, and said one word. There. The incision became exact. The pellet was plucked out. A breath steadied. One precise piece of information turned guessing into an act that preserved a lung. Her daughter worked at the bench as partner, not heir. Irene stood at the plate holder, labeled images, learned to read density like a language. Technique mattered more than family ties. The craft passed hand to hand, quiet, exact, practical. The personal cost was visible in small ways. Dirty gloves that could not be fully washed, calloused hands from plates and wounded limbs, sleepless nights where exposure decisions meant one life saved and another lost. She adjusted exposure times, improvised shielding when lead was scarce, made plates readable with minimal gear. When a device failed, she fixed it with wire and determination. Machines were tools. She kept them tools, not curiosities. Word spread. Doctors who once called the work theoretical now asked for plates first. The Little Curies rolled across muddy roads and left a track of healed men and more cautious surgeons. A coin-sized shadow on a plate and the sound of a pincer closing became how field medics counted small miracles. Not miracles exactly. Transposed technique. Theory stripped of ceremony and given a scalpel. She had done more than convert equipment. She turned a laboratory light into measured kindness. The radiological car translated knowledge into rescue. That was her clearest argument against locking science behind patents. Share the method, and lives are saved. At day's end, she sometimes sat with a single plate, wiping dust from its face, thinking in numbers, exposures, yields, lives affected. No boast, no lyric, just a ledger closing with a tied bandages, plain satisfaction. What she had wrested out of stone and salt had found hands that could use it. For her then, science meant the exact saving of a person whose future could not be reduced to a headline. They called it a small miracle in the papers, a nation raising money for a scrap of matter that shone when no one looked directly at it. The campaign began in parlors and church basements, women passing the hat, counting coins. It moved into civic clubs, factory committees, sewing circles. Each contribution was tiny, a franc a dime, a gesture, and together they became more than charity, a public stake in a piece of science. She arrived to receive the gift without theatrics. The gram of radium did not glitter like jewelry. It was dense, small, kept in a lead-lined box and wrapped with the careful handling reserved for instruments. There was a hush when the box opened, not worship, but the hush of people who understood a practical responsibility was being handed across a threshold. The president presented the box with polite gravity. Cameras clicked. Headlines were written. She accepted the vial with gloves, the way she would accept a newly calibrated instrument. Her face did not melt into the gratitude the press expected. She was moved, but precise. She unwrapped the lead, lifted the inner vial, and measured it with her eyes. Heavy in the gloved palm, it felt not like treasure, but like charge. She was not taking radium for herself. She was taking it for the work. Her public remarks were short and direct. This is a tool to be used, taught, and shared. When someone suggested the element be displayed as proof of national generosity, she dismissed the idea with lab-like economy. Show me a method, and I will show you a use. Show me a display, and you have only an object. The donors had given not to create a spectacle, but to seed practice. She translated gratitude into obligation with precise rules. The gram would be catalogued, subdivided under strict precautions, portions allocated to hospitals and research centers. Each transfer would come with training, manuals, demonstrations, hands-on sessions. The radium would not be hoarded. It would be taught. Knowledge, locked away, was knowledge wasted. When photographers wanted poses, she lifted the vial for the frame and then put it back in its lead casing. She refused long interviews that would turn the moment personal. Instead, she convened meetings with hospital administrators and chemistry professors to put the material to use immediately. The effects were quick. Portions went to hospitals where therapeutic experiments were standardized. Other portions went to labs with instructions: measure, document, share. Young women became technicians and researchers through training sessions that turned curiosity into craft. The gram became a multiplier. Careful, repeated trials scaled knowledge beyond the size of that initial gift. There was a lesson in governance. The women who had pooled pennies had bought not a souvenir, but a democratic instrument, the possibility that other hands could learn to do the same work. When donors asked if the radium would go to museums, she answered with a rule: instruments belong where they can be used, not put on pedestals. In private, she handled the vial as she handled all things that mattered, with gloves, with respect, with a ledger. She wrote every transfer, every recipient, every intended purpose. Recording was a civic promise. The gram was a node in a network of practice, accepted on behalf of thousands who had pooled pennies and will. The crowd had wanted a hero they could admire at a distance. She demanded participation instead. Her question to a nation was practical. Will you invest in a light that is not yours? Will you fund a process, not a portrait? The gram of radium sat small and dense in its box, holding one proposition. Understanding requires not only minds, but a willingness to put resources where learning can happen. She saw the Institute as a machine, not a monument. When the funds arrived and the walls went up, she paced empty corridors checking alignments, door widths, bench heights, a stair that wouldn't creak when a tired hand leaned on it. From the first nail, the building was practical: wide windows to vent fumes, locked storage to keep inventory straight, a small lecture hall where every student could see a demonstration. It was built by people who expected work. She called it a ladder, literally. Ground-level workshops for course separations, mid-level rooms for careful analysis and teaching, an upper floor for consultation, archives, and slow method writing. Students started low and climbed as they proved competence. Skills were earned, not handed down as titles. The curriculum staged competence: hold glass, recognize fractures, prepare a precipitate, document a result so another lab in another city could get the same number on the page. She hammered procedures into the institute, like TOS, rivets, checklists at every bench, laminated protocols a student had to read before touching a pipette, a cross-check system where one apprentice read steps aloud and the other confirmed. What looked pedantic to visitors was protection to her, against error, vanity, and the habits that let discoveries die with a person. Method made light portable. Teach it, and it could travel. Her circulars read like orders because they were meant to be executed. Calibrate balances daily. Note ambient humidity. Always plate with labeled orientation. Each sentence was a small legalism for a lab. Enforceable, clear, repeatable. Her handwriting grew economical and deliberate. An administrator once told her she had the voice of stewardship. She accepted it as praise. Staffing the institute was an experiment itself. She hired people who could teach, not just perform. Technicians paired with students. Lectures followed by hands-on stations until a separation matched the template. Women found professional roles, not curiosities. There were disputes, budgets, credits, conditional donations, and she handled them like a failed distillation. Note the variables. Exclude the contaminated sample. Proceed. Her presence became a series of brief, exact acts. Strength waned, so she conserved energy for high-leverage moves. A corridor question that corrected procedure. A margin note that read, "Reduce wash volume. Yield improved." Those terse interventions carried force because staff implemented them and the protocol updated. She used limited power as strategy. Letters piled up. Collaboration requests, endowment offers, pleas for samples. She replied in compact sentences that answered and reinforced the ethic. Share protocols. Train recipients. Do not patent. Refusing fenced methods sometimes cost money, but it made the work reproducible abroad and useful at home. Visiting delegations left with notebooks full of procedure. Rural clinics received standardized plates with margin notes on exposure. The latter reached beyond the building. She institutionalized oversight. Audit notebooks, a registry of who touched what and when. A protocol for safety codified and taught. Precautions were part of the contract she had always spoken of. Borrow light from nature, and you owe accounting and care. The Institute turned a private miracle into public practice. Young researchers climbed the ladder and then taught others. Methods crossed borders. Radium left benches and moved into therapies with standards and consent. Her role shifted from sole discoverer to guardian of a system. Less solitary glory, more durable effect. She accepted the trade because the ledger showed multiplication of competent hands, not accumulation of trophies. On days when fatigue made speech short, she walked corridors slowly, leaning on rails like someone inspecting a machine in slow motion. Students watched her pause at a calibrated balance or bend to examine a plate. Those pauses taught as much as any lecture. She corrected a mislabel with a terse note, and the change went into the protocol. The Institute ran like a well-designed tool. Parts replaced, standards maintained, knowledge carried forward without collapsing into personality. The staircase was literal and moral. Each step a student took proved the ladder worked, not to make saints, but to produce people who could do the thing again and teach strangers. The building hummed with ordinary sounds, glass clinking, pens scratching, ovens cooling. That ordinary noise became the Institute's anthem. She had turned a private light into a public ladder, translating discovery into a contract anyone could sign by showing up and doing the work. The note from the physician arrived like any other memo, neat, factual, without rhetoric. It said what the ledger had already begun to whisper. The marrow was failing. Blood tests returned numbers that read like an accounting of disappearance. She looked at the sheet as she looked at a failed separation. Not theatrical, only data to be understood and acted upon. The words were dry, aplastic anemia, but their consequence was immediate and total. Sleep became thin currency. Nights stretched long and bright with small restless motions, turning a page, rubbing a finger, checking a margin for a line she had meant to add. Insomnia was another condition to note. She counted hours by what work she could fit between dawn and the exhaustion that finally closed her eyes. Weakness arrived subtle, then insistent. Hands that had once been instruments stuttered on fine glass. Tasks that had been reflex required recalculation. Where she once thought in sequences and contingencies, now she economized moments, choosing which experiments to start and which to hand off. Her face changed in ways cameras missed. A precise pallor settled, not poetic, but medical. Less oxygen, fewer cells, less circulating life. She did not cloak it in metaphor. She recorded it. Notes to colleagues read, "Adjust timeline. Expect slower returns." Goodbyes were practical. Instructions on a desk, a sealed packet of reagents labeled for the next technician, a short directive for the day after. No public will, no theatrical testament. She rewrote protocols, updated curricula, penciled corrections in margins. Paperwork became a form of prayer. Museum curators would later handle her notebooks with leaded gloves, but those pages had never been relics to her. They were tools. At night, the archive pages sometimes caught a faint residual luminescence, a literal echo of the work. It was not nostalgia. It was material proof that a process had happened. Domestic scenes tightened into the new logic of her days. A neighbor brought soup. She ate half and returned to drafts. A student handed a report. She skimmed it with the focus of someone checking a calculation against a trusted method. Daughters and colleagues offered gentleness. She accepted kindness while refusing pity to reroute the enterprise. Conversations grew short and exact. Catalog this, test that. Instruct her on plate prep tomorrow at 10. Humor thinned but remained. An economy of levity that kept things human without adding burden. Sometimes she sat, gloved and cautious, and watched the faint reflection in a vial. Not ritual, but audit, checking object to purpose. As nights lengthened and handwriting shrank to fewer deliberate marks, she accepted the narrowing as part of an equation. No melodrama, only practiced calm. She trusted the ladder she had built. Procedures, trainees, published methods that would carry the light forward without her constant presence. In the end, the ledger closed with simple entries. Tasks completed, protocols updated, instructions filed. The rest was handed over. Her final silence was not absence of voice, but the result of a completed assignment. The notebooks glowed faintly in storage, not with memory, but with embedded work. Immortality, as she understood it, was not bronze or eulogy. It was continuation of use, a method applied the day after she could no longer apply it, a student repeating a separation and finding the same result, a surgeon saving a life, because someone had taught carefully. That was the quiet of her closing chapter. No trumpet, no last grand speech, only the ledger, the gloves, the careful passing of tools and knowledge. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was a space where others would speak with the instruments she left, and where the light she coaxed from darkness would keep doing what she had always wanted it to do. Work. She had always reduced life to a short list of obligations, and in the end, those obligations fit in the fist of a hand. Do not fear. Understand. Share. Or it is not knowledge. Pay the price, or the idea is only theater. Those 3 rules were blunt because they had to be. She lived by them like a craftsperson follows rules for tempering metal. Each instruction calibrated, so something useful would not crack under heat. Do not fear. Understand. She refused terror in front of the unknown. When salts glowed on a shelf, she did not recoil in horror. She measured, labeled, repeated, taught. Fear, in her vocabulary, was noise that wrecked experiments. Understanding was the instrument that turned danger into work. She taught generations to convert brave curiosity into reliable procedure. Look, do not look away. Record, do not invent. Test, do not trust rumor. Approach a glowing vial like a musician approaches a new piece, intently, respectfully, patient, share, otherwise it is not knowledge. She chose the hard route, publish methods, give protocols, put careful notes in hands that would not lock them away. When women in parlors raised pennies for a gram of radium, she did not keep a trophy. She parceled it out with instructions. The Institute closed the loop. Training, checklists, cross-checks, and the insistence that a method is validated only when other hands can reproduce it. Knowledge behind a patent or a gate is preserved for vanity. Her practice treated generosity as technical imperative. The wider the distribution of method, the fewer people would be at the mercy of guesswork. Hospitals using what she taught did not need legend. They needed steps that saved lungs, limbs, lives. Pay the price, or the idea is theater. Her ledger recorded literal costs, blisters, falling blood counts, nights in clinics instead of salons. She tallied each bruise and sleepless hour without flinching. That was the honest demand of her life, an idea that does not cost anything. Risks being a pretty story. Paying was not self-abnegation, but responsibility. A true idea needed labor, maintenance, sometimes bodily wear. These obligations had immediate consequences. The light she coaxed from ore became an operating lamp, a diagnostic plate that told a surgeon where to cut, a protocol in a rural clinic that converted rumor into remedy. People who never heard her name lived under lamps she made acceptable. That fact was the sharpest rebuke to those who preferred spectacle to craft. They received care because someone insisted the method be shareable and teachable, and because someone accepted the immediate cost. The world did not always like that contract. Crowds loved heroes in marble because statues ask nothing back. Living heroes ask questions and require investment. She turned away from applause in favor of practice. The gram of radium, the lecture hall, the institute, the mobile X-ray vans. Not trophies, but nodes in a system built so light would be a tool, not a token. In the archive, a dosimeter still clicked while attendants swaddled notebooks in lead. That small persistent sound was not threat, but metronome. It measured proximity and responsibility. The dosimeter's tick was not accusation. It was an invitation to account for what you used and what you left behind. Her final challenge was simple and blunt. You already live under lamps she helped light. You have been treated by rays she made practical. You have moved through systems she shaped. Gratitude is not the point. The question she left the living was precise. How much light can your heart bear? What will you invest? Time, attention, resources, so that understanding is not a luxury, but a shared capability? In the end, the invitation was practical and terrifying in its simplicity. Do not fear. Understand. Share. Do not hoard. Pay the price. Do not perform. The ledger she left was minimal and exact. The rest was up to whoever stood next at the bench. The dosimeter kept clicking. The light kept waiting.